preacher who ever includes environment in a sermon. In his sermon be blessed. And may our numbers increase rapidly. Thank you to Earth Ministry for supporting preaching that includes the environment. My sermon is based on a reading from Leviticus 19, verses 9 to 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. The Lord your God has spoken. I work at Gettysburg Seminary on the Gettysburg battlefield, where monuments mark the fighting from the Civil War in 1863 that came to our campus. If you go out the doors of our chapel and turn left and walk about 2 miles on a street called Confederate Avenue, you'll come to a metal tower. And you go up its many steps and you get to a platform, maybe it's 2.5 stories up, maybe 3 stories up. And you look out, you'll see what the fields looked like about 150 years ago. At least the outlines of them. Because the Park Service tries to keep the area looking a lot like it did back at the time of the battle. And you'll notice there that the fields were smaller than most of them are nowadays. They had boundaries. They used to have hedgerows or edge areas. And sometimes trees and shrubs, or maybe a waterway running along those edges. And in Amish country, which is near us too, you also see small fields like that. And sometimes they're oddly shaped because they're following the contour of the land. But nowadays, most of the productive farm fields aren't like that. In the 1950s and 60s, when the big machinery came along at the same time that petrochemical fertilizers and bold new hybrid crops were on the rise, American farmers began to plant hedgerow to hedgerow, and then an agriculture secretary came along with a slogan, "Get big or get out." And that advice, as many of you know, led, among other things, to larger fields. Fewer and fewer farmers work more and more land today. And now there are no hedgerows at all, usually. The big machines cover huge distances and roll over those old boundaries. The whole story was told by author Wendell Berry in his classic book, The Unsettling of America. Well, Leviticus 19, that I just read, stands in stark contrast. Leviticus 19 seems like it's from a different world. Well, the author I just mentioned, Wendell Berry, was in the news last spring, about 5 months ago. He left home to go to visit his governor's office in Kentucky. And when he left, he put a toothbrush in his breast pocket of his sport coat, because he didn't know for sure if he'd be coming back that night, or if maybe he'd have to spend the night in jail. He and 13 others weren't planning any sort of a crime, really, but they were going to go to the governor's office, and they weren't going to leave until they got a chance to talk to him. You see, they wanted to discuss their concerns about coal mining in Kentucky. They had tried all the regular means that good citizens use, right? They wrote letters to representatives, they mounted public campaigns, they tried to influence the legislation, but none of those efforts could stop the abusive kind of mining that's been tearing apart the mountains. You see, there's this new kind of mining which rolls out over huge areas with massive machines and explosives. Operators scrape off the rock and topsoil at the tops of mountains to expose the coal seams that everybody used to think you couldn't get because they're up in the tops of the mountains. But now they scrape off the tops, and what they call the debris, they plow over the sides. And that technique is called valley filling. Streams are clogged and floods ensue, and mountaintop removal mining respects no boundaries, no natural boundaries. It plows over the former edges. Nature's high and low places are little obstacle against today's technological might. And then when they're done, it's reseeded in grass like a golf course. And the plateaued heights of much of Kentucky, West Virginia, and southwestern Pennsylvania, where I come from, have lost their forests, their biotic communities, their waterways. The people who live there are suffering ill health, contaminated water, and shattered culture. And so Wendell Berry went to the governor's office with his toothbrush and 13 others, and they ended up staying 3 nights. So it's a good thing he took it along. They did talk to the governor, who remains convinced that mountaintop removal mining does not hurt the land and does not hurt the people. He says it's Kentucky's best hope for economic prosperity. We might say the governor prefers a different kind of margin than the real physical margin at the edges of the mountains. And so Leviticus 19 stands in stark contrast to the governor's politics. Margins are good places. In the fields that Leviticus 19 describes, the margins are places that the poor could find food and the alien could get along. Modern ecologists tell us, too, that the edges are where the interesting things happen. The old hedgerows, the old tree stands along waterways at the edges of fields are great places for species diversity. The mountainsides and valleys with their stream beds are also great places for species diversity. At Gettysburg Seminary, where I work and teach, we recently got a little survey of the natural life on our campus and the nearby area. And we found out there's over 10 species of concern living with us, from a certain kind of little yellow warbler to some different butterflies, shoe-marked oaks and shell-bark hickories, and even one species that is of such concern that the conservationists have told us not to mention what it is. We're discussing how the campus could serve as a kind of an edge or margin that could help these species and others survive. And it helps our species, we humans, to be around the others and have a healthy community around us. Well, the Holiness Code of Leviticus had something to say about living with the margins. In the margins, strangers get hospitality, aliens get some rights. And in our day, we can add that in margins, more species will survive. And maybe even human greed could be reined in at least a little bit. Leviticus is clear that people are to live simple, decent lives and not take too much. The land is to be cared for. And when the land isn't cared for, Leviticus says in the chapter before this, that the land vomited the people out. And it very well may do so again, the Holiness Code says, in a rather prescient ecological, who wear out their welcome in the governor's office and then obstinately write and speak and proclaim that there could be another way. And I've seen something else. I've seen a table that was first set in the last hours before a generous person named Jesus was betrayed and taken away to die. At that table, Jesus welcomed the marginal, the nobodies and aliens of this world who had no real power or place. The people with Jesus were the downstream, down-valley types, the type that get valley fill dumped on their heads and their homes ripped out from under them. The people with Jesus at the table he spread were the type that fish all night and catch nothing. The people of Jesus were the type that the Caesars and Herods and Pilates in the world knew only as slaves and servants in their designs of power and wealth. But God prefers margins. And so Jesus went to an edge called Golgotha and laid down his blessing upon the margin. He dipped his one who would betray him, but still fed the marginal ones whom he loved. And you are only footsteps from the table that he alone sets. His table is the margin of the Lord's field. So come and glean at that table, and then go out with new eyes to see all the margins and edges that are still there, where God is still working love and forgiveness and righteousness and hospitality to strangers and reforestation for species of concern, and even, I dare say, a chance for those who might climb down off of their roaring machines and lift their eyes and behold the real margins that they thought they pushed away. But for the time being, keep your toothbrush in your pocket.